In the time of Ebola, youth, family, and emergency in Sierra Leone, the anthropologist Jonah Lipton was in Freetown, Sierra Leone, when the largest Ebola outbreak in history hit. It is the subject of a fascinating and different book that has just come out. I'm delighted to say that Jonah joins us live on the line now. Jonah, good morning to you.
Good morning, Giles.
Thanks for joining me. Whereabouts are you, by the way? Are you in Freetown or are you in the UK? Where are you?
Yeah, I'm back in the UK, so I'm in London now.
So for those who don't know, explain a little bit about what you were doing, and also because I don't think many people may be aware kind of exactly where Sierra Leone and what Freetown is like.
Yeah, so my background is in social anthropology, and I was doing a PhD back in 2014. And what social anthropologists do is they go and live in a community in another place in the world for an extended period of time. So at the London School of Economics, where I was doing my PhD, we would go and spend a year and a half living in a community in a different part of the world and immersing yourself in the life of that community. You do things like learn the language, you would build close relationships with people around you, and every day you would record what was happening in these sort of field notes. So my research project was in Sierra Leone, which is a country in West Africa. Freetown is the capital city of that country. So I was out there. And I was actually out there before the Ebola epidemic. I think, Sierra Leone became kind of famous in the international news for the Ebola epidemic. There were previous things, of course, as well. But, this was the largest Ebola outbreak in history. And it affected 3 West African countries were at the core of the epidemic. There was Guinea, Sierra Leone, and Liberia. So I was out there living in this community in the capital city, Freetown, which is a coastal city. It's a big port town. It's very connected to the sort of Atlantic world. It was originally, actually, it has an incredibly interesting history, which I can kind of get into now a little bit if you like. So it's currently it's a poor, large city with a port town. It has a very kind of interesting history that it was established by former slaves from the British Empire after the international ban on the slave trade. So actually the first settlers were 400 Londoners, black Londoners, who returned to Africa to set up this kind of free city where they could kind of live freely. And then they were joined by other former slaves from other sort of parts of the British Empire. So that was kind of the history of Freetown. And then it became the sort of capital city of British West Africa. So it was a major sort of British colonial city. So when you go to the downtown areas of Freetown, you'll see old English kind of churches. You'll even see sort of red post boxes around and, this kind of British colonial stuff. And then Sierra Leone gained independence in the early 60s. I was living in a sort of urban community that I would say was pretty poor, but it was kind of a mixed community. It was very, very tight knit. People really knew each other extremely well. They lived these very sort of integrated lives. 9 months into this fieldwork project, which actually began looking at, I was really interested in the lives of young people, in particular young adults, and looking at kind of family life among young adults in Freetown. And that was kind of an interesting question because they had a civil war in Sierra Leone in the 1990s. That was also another thing that people kind of think of Sierra Leone, associate with Sierra Leone. So there was a civil war, and many of the fighters in that war, many of the rebel soldiers were these sort of young men in particular. And many of them migrated afterwards to Freetown and sort of tried to build up their lives. And so I was kind of looking at that process, looking at those young people and how they were going in building up their lives. There I am, kind of living in this community. And then 9 months into this project, I hear about this virus, this outbreak of a virus. At that point, it was across the border. It was in the neighboring country in Guinea. But those sort of rural borderland areas, people regularly cross them. The border is pretty informal in those rural areas, and people have family across the border. So people were kind of moving back and forth, and the virus spread into Sierra Leone, and then it sort of began to spread through the country. And then a state of emergency was declared, and the WHO, the World Health Organization, declared an international public health emergency of international concern, and then after that, a major humanitarian intervention kind of landed in Freetown.
But a couple of points on this one. How long was the time before you first start hearing these rumors about, there's something happening at the border, and there may be a virus out there? And obviously, Ebola is highly infectious. It's deadly. It kind of basically liquefies your organs, isn't it? It's a horrendous. It's a horrendous virus. And what was the sort of the reaction? Did you feel this was building, or was it like literally one day you're sitting there, looking over the beautiful beaches of Freetown, and the next thing you're in this hellish situation?
Yeah, so it was pretty gradual. I remember I first heard about it from one of my friends, who was hosting me, and he was basically, he had this WhatsApp group, and there were these pictures of someone, in this horrible condition, and it talked about this virus that had spread across the border. On these WhatsApp groups, I was sort of used to a lot of sort of fake news, so I kind of didn't believe it at first, actually. But of course, it turned out to be accurate. Ebola is pretty infectious. It's a lot less infectious than COVID is, for example. It's not airborne. So you have to have direct contact with someone who is symptomatic or has died from the virus to sort of to catch the virus. But it's extremely deadly. About 50% of people who catch the virus did at that point at least die from the virus. So in Sierra Leone, across the whole outbreak, so this is across the 3 countries, there were 30,000 deaths between 2014 and 2016 because of the Ebola virus. So it started, I felt, as almost a kind of a rumor, and then it obviously did spread. The international response was kind of quite slow off the mark. They kind of didn't take it that seriously at the beginning. And then they sort of realized that this was something to be pretty afraid of. And there was a very, very large intervention, that landed after that.
Were you given the option to get out? I mean, was that an option for you, or did you think, I'm going to stay here, or you couldn't move? Why did you take the decision to sort of stay there, as it were?
Yeah, so I stayed for quite a while, a number of months after the outbreak, and when there was a state of emergency. I felt like, I didn't know people around me who had caught it by that point. And I felt, because of, like I just said, it wasn't airborne, and you had to really be looking after people who are sick there, or washing the corpses of people who are dead. That was also another way that people caught the virus. I felt if I could avoid those things, I could be fairly safe. But when when it became quite scary for me was when international sort of commercial flights stopped operating. So some of the major airlines stopped flying there, and I was worried that I would get stuck there. And my department, there was one that still was continuing to fly, and my department, back in London, said, we really think you should leave at this point. So I left for 5 months, during which time I was really in close contact, with the community that I was living in. And then I returned after 5 months to sort of continue the research when it felt like it was safe enough to do that.
So what measures were they? Did they lock down? Was it wearing masks? I mean, what was the day? Because obviously life in Africa is all on the streets, and especially in Freetown. I mean, the people are out mingling, aren't they? I mean, markets, etc. It is a life on the streets. So was there lockdown? Was there quarantine? I mean, how did it manifest itself, Jonah?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So there was a state of emergency. There was a lot of checkpoints, on the roads. It was quite difficult to travel between towns. You would get kind of your temperature monitored. There were lockdowns, sort of not as long actually as the COVID lockdowns that many of us experienced, but they would have kind of 3-day lockdowns. There was quarantines of homes. So if someone was ill and that they received a positive Ebola test, which wasn't that straightforward at the time to get Ebola tests. It wasn't like a sort of rapid COVID test that we can do. But yeah, they had to be sent to a lab. But anyway, if they got that positive test, then their house was quarantined. So you would actually see like sort of police stationed outside the house, trying to prevent people coming in and out. But I think you really raise a good point about the life in African cities being public. It made it very difficult, to quarantine. People are kind of moving in and out of homes all the time. There's a kind of fluidity to social life there. There's a lot of life out on the streets. I think one of the biggest areas of regulation actually was around death and burial, which may be something we don't think about as much. But yeah, as I think I mentioned, it was through sort of washing. The traditional way of preparing a body for burial is through washing the corpse before the burial. And obviously, with Ebola deaths, that was really a dangerous thing to do and was one of the ways that it was transmitted. So there was a huge amount of regulation around that people were not allowed to perform burials themselves. And they actually established these teams who was trained to they called it safe and dignified burials. So they were trained to perform burials in a safe way, but also try to take on some of the sort of traditional ways that burials are performed so that people would kind of cooperate with it and also feel like they were able to grieve. And I actually had one of my kind of what we call anthropologists call interlocutors, basically one of the people that I was doing research with, ended up being recruited in one of these burial teams and invited me to come along. And I would keep a safe distance from the corpse, of course, but I was sort of observing as an anthropologist the activities of these teams. And it was quite interesting. I think like a lot of people felt a lot of tension between different sets of sort of obligations and expectations. So on the one hand, they wanted to follow these new regulations. They wanted to be safe and not, spread the virus. But on the other hand, there's a lot of very strong obligations around performing burials in an appropriate way. You have to perform. People wanted to perform it at their local cemeteries where they would be buried along with other family members who had passed away. Or they wanted to, most people in Freetown are Muslim or Christian, so they wanted to have some of those practices involved as well. And it was, very tricky for people to kind of figure out how to sort of balance these different sets of expectations.
Well, what I find interesting is the fact that we're not very well informed about this particular part of Africa, of West Africa, about Sierra Leone, about I don't know, Ivory Coast, etc. We sort of tend to, we always tend to think of the big, the Nigerias, the South Africas, the big, if you like, the big hitters, and we don't we tend to think from a Western point of view, we tend to use broad strokes when we're dealing with Africa, which is obviously you miss the nuances and you miss the, like you said, the lifestyle and also the practices and traditions. What made me smart, because you're looking at various people that you've been interacting with, and the name Kamara comes out, doesn't it? Is that quite a common name in Sierra Leone?
Exactly. Yes, that's a very common surname. Yeah.
Because I have two friends from Freetown, and their surname is Kamara, which made me smile when I saw this. So you're putting a human face then on this, because it'd be very easy to write I did this and then I did that, but it's the experience of people going through this sort of crisis. So we don't go, oh, it's another African story.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean putting the human face on was really important. And I think that's something that anthropology can kind of bring to the table, because that's what anthropology is all about. That's sort of what we're trained to do. And I think like when there was, this was reported a lot in the news at the time, so people got a sense of it. But what people don't realize is that it means that their association with Africa is just sort of crisis and emergency. And actually, a lot of people are living these very sort of these family lives. There's people are watching football, people are listening to music, and they're living these sort of rich cultural family lives and also community lives. And I'm trying to sort of say, in the book, I'm trying to say, like, what does a kind of big emergency look like for people, when you start not from the kind of starting point of the emergency, but when you start from the starting point of life in an ordinary community? Like, what ordinary people's experiences of emergencies like, and how does that sort of change the way that we maybe see emergencies and actually sort of respond to emergencies when we take kind of day-to-day ordinary life as a sort of starting point.
And two things come off that. One is, because when the pandemic hit the UK, everybody was saying, "Oh, it was wonderful. I got to know my neighbours. We were all standing on the front porch and applauding, and we felt like a community again." So one is, would I be right in presuming there's a bigger sense of community in Freetown, i.e. the family unit is still intact? And the second one is, do you have to be sort of quite careful when an outside organisation such as the World Health Organization or whoever goes in, that it isn't being kind of imperialist or, "Oh, we're here now, you don't know what you're doing because you're Africans"?
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. Yeah. I mean, I think there are differences in how people live in, different parts of the world. And I think that, that there are that is the life, day-to-day life in Freetown is just, people do absolutely know their neighbors. They're totally reliant on their neighbors. And I think when there's a sort of emergency, people kind of look after each other. But of course, when it's an epidemic, it also puts people at danger if they're living in that sort of close proximity. And that second point, Giles, is absolutely is a really, really important point to make. In many ways in Freetown, the intervention was welcome. There were aspects of it, I would say, that were welcome. People liked the fact that there was, they were building up this sort of medical infrastructure, and that the intervention ended up sort of creating for a temporary period of time a sort of semblance of like a kind of normal health system that people were kind of wanted in many ways. But I think one of the major problems with it was it was temporary. So this intervention ended up costing $3.5 billion. But it absolutely was not built to last. So I remember visiting a treatment center. I was back in Sierra Leone. I was actually in a rural area a couple years, just like maybe 1 or 2 years after the end of the outbreak. So this was sort of in 2018 or something like that. And someone took me to visit an old Ebola treatment center, and it was completely dilapidated. It had been built with temporary materials. It was overgrown. It was like they didn't have the sort of intervention, the humanitarian response that built it. They didn't have any idea of that this should be a lasting contribution to Sierra Leone's health system, which is extremely under-resourced, And I think that was a major sort of turning point in the way I saw it, was thinking, okay, so, this intervention, they were trying to do something, they were trying to prevent the spread of this disease, which was a sort of really legitimate thing. But actually they were sort of leaving the health system in the same kind of precarious situation that it was before. And when we think about that, it means, viruses, zoonotic viruses that can transmit from animals to humans, like Ebola or COVID. If there's another one of these, and there is Mpox, it's not in Sierra Leone now, but it is in other African countries, the actual health system and the Sierra Leone state will actually be in absolutely the same sort of position that it was in before, and not able to sort of contain it by itself, and therefore sort of reliant on an international intervention, which kind of reinforces those same sort of, like you say, almost sort of imperial dynamics. Yeah,
it's a stereotype that Africa can't look after itself, but at the same point, it's a bit like being a fireman and going to fight a fire out and saying, okay, well, look after yourselves, and by the way, there's a box of matches, because if you don't put the system in and the training in, you can't nip it early in the bud.
Absolutely, that's absolutely right. And I think you also have to look at the sort of broader politics and economy that's going on. Sierra Leone has a lot of mineral wealth. There's diamonds there, there's bauxite, and the other minerals that, there's extreme mineral wealth, but it's actually most of it, nearly all of it, does not go to benefit sort of ordinary people in Sierra Leone. Sierra Leoneans are extremely poor, and the state is extremely under-resourced. Most of these resources are owned by foreign corporations, or they sort of are bought extremely cheaply and end up sort of benefiting rich countries, really, to put it very bluntly. And you could sort of think about it, if you think about it that way, if Sierra Leone had a kind of strong state, or and this is very common across other countries in Africa as well, if they had a strong state, if they were able to control their own resources, they could build up the health system, and they could sort of do this by themselves and not be reliant on the international support. But actually, the current situation of not having a strong state means that, these resources can be bought or extracted very, very cheaply by the international sort of corporations and community. And it sort of keeps that sort of system intact.
Yeah. And also, again, it reinforces that thing that Africa is corrupt. So there's no point giving the money to the government because they'll buy themselves Mercedes and the rest of the community won't get it. And that's just, it's the narrative as always, that sort of imperialistic thing. I'm just thinking about the effect as well that this had on sort of young people, because I talk a lot about this with the situation we went through a couple of years ago, and how, I'm in my 50s. If that had happened, COVID had happened when I was in my teens, I don't think I would have been able to sort of cope with it really that well. What sort of effect did it have on to young men and young women in Freetown, in Sierra Leone in general?
Yeah, so a lot of young people in Freetown are caught in what has been termed the crisis of youth. So this is sort of the thing where, being able to sort of gather, it's hard to come by a good job, or people work in these sort of informal jobs and maybe they can make some money, but it's hard to sort of get regular income. It's hard to buy a house, that kind of thing. So, and this is a problem that people in Africa face. Of course, it's a problem that a lot of people around the world now are facing, young people. And so basically it means they're sort of stuck in what people call the crisis of youth. So it's sort of, they're getting older, but they're not able to sort of reach adulthood in a kind of socially sort of respected way. So they sort of end up getting stuck in this intermediate sort of category, which is sort of quite unstable and maybe a little bit stigmatized and things like that. So I think Ebola, that was sort of the context that many people were in before Ebola. And I think Ebola had this sort of quite unusual impact. On the one hand, it was another crisis that people had to deal with and another obstacle. But on the other hand, it was actually a kind of an opportunity for people who were already, especially young people who were already in this kind of crisis. And this is something I, talk about in the book, but it's really, I mentioned before the example of a young man named Peter who was working as a motorbike taxi driver in Freetown, and that was this informal profession, and it was quite dangerous, but it was a way of making money, and it was actually quite actively sort of I was oppressed by the state, I would say, or the police would regularly pull over these drivers and try and get fines from them or bribes and try and prevent them from operating in the downtown area. So there was a sort of fight that they were having with the state before Ebola. And Peter was actually quite active in the Motorbike Taxi Drivers Union. So this was a quite impressive organization that was set up where a lot of drivers came together to sort of try and get more rights, basically, and protection, so that they could sort of perform their job, more safely. So that was sort of the thing. But he had never held a sort of regular salary job. He was working in this kind of informal economy. And then during Ebola, they needed a lot of workers to sort of man, and a lot of young men and women ended up working in the Ebola response. And so Peter was recruited as a motorbike taxi driver for one of the burial teams, and he would go and he would collect a sample from the person who had died, and he would take it on his bike to a lab to be processed, and that was the Ebola test. So he ended up performing this really important function, in the Ebola response that was really central, like a lot of young people. And he also had an income, it was a well-paid sort of normal income every month. It was reliable. And so, Ebola for him in this strange way was also a kind of opportunity to build something.
Because this is the thing, isn't it? Because people go, and I'm not going to get geopolitical, but this is the reason we've got migration on some points, because there's, especially now with smartphones, people are seeing a world which seems to be utopia for them, and they want to get out of their sleepy wherever they are. And if you cannot build a life, then you'll go somewhere where you think you can. And again, we go on about, if we give these people jobs that are worth doing and just don't go, it's Africa, then we won't have the problems that we get now and to build, because I said before, Sierra Leone is a beautiful country. I've seen the beaches. It's tourists would die for that, the colour of those beaches. And that's perhaps, again, it's a problem, because did you see there was any resentment that, they came, we all had jobs, and now we're back to square one?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I think that's really true that people, do see, they do look at Europe and and other places and they think, this is actually, if I'm going to survive, I need to, if I need to make an income, this is the place I can do that and to kind of send money back and support my family and build up in my own life. It's hard to do it in Freetown. And you have to think about all the broader reasons why that is. It's, there is this wealth there, but most people don't get to see any of it. And I think the international community has a lot to say, a lot to do with that as well. So yeah, I think that is absolutely sort of how I see, and it's an interesting point you make about the beaches. Like, I think if the economy was a bit stronger in Sierra Leone, people wouldn't, want to leave. It is a really beautiful country. And, I would really highly recommend your listeners to visit. It's really a beautiful place.
What are you hoping that people are going to take, from your book, Jonah?
Yeah, I mean, I think it works on different levels. I think, one of the things is it does tell these stories that are not anywhere else. We didn't get to really hear and follow the lives of ordinary people, living their lives, before an emergency, during the Ebola emergency, and then afterwards. I went back and I returned and followed these lives. And so part of it is just, if you're interested in the lives of people and understanding what people's lives in somewhere like Sierra Leone are like, it tells those stories, and hopefully in quite a sort of entertaining way. And then I think on another level, it also has these lessons for, how we can go about doing, public health or global health better. I think there's lessons that we can learn for future epidemics, and there's lessons that we can learn for sort of thinking about new crises over in Africa.
The book, unfortunately, I'm going to run out of time. The book is called In the Time of Ebola. You can order it from our own virtual bookstore. Jonah, thank you so much for your time today.
Giles, it was really great to talk to you. Thank you.
TRE, Talk Radio Europe.